It's good to be back with you today. I continue to urge you to write down your questions as you have them, because, for example, now again, as we did yesterday, we'll give you a chance to ask questions with regard to what we've done up to this point. Before we ask for those questions, let me briefly summarize what we have done in terms of the latest developments in our discussion. We have indicated the major steps in inductive Bible study, the core of which is inductive inferential reasoning. And you'll note that I'm using recurrence. I'm going to say this a number of times, and I hope it registers in the process. And those steps are, of course, pray, especially for believers, observe and ask. And we indicated three aspects of that to which we'll return. The book as a whole, followed by questions about one's findings. That has to do with survey. We'll talk about that further. Then you begin moving to analysis. Although it's a combination of survey and analysis, you're moving from the whole to the parts and beginning to break the parts down, followed again by questions. And we've indicated what those various parts are, all the way from divisions, which are the largest units in the book as a whole, to segments, which are the smallest units for this purpose. And then finally, to the most detailed area, detailed observation involving individual paragraphs all the way down to individual terms, followed by questions. And that gets into analysis in a very major way. Followed then by answering questions, which involves interpretation. That involves more analysis, but also synthesis. And we'll talk about this a little later on. And then you evaluate and apply and finally correlate, which is the ultimate synthesis in terms of the total scriptures. The previous synthesis has to do with a particular passage at hand that's being studied. Now let me emphasize several things with regard to these matters. The first I've indicated I would do, and that is note the movement from the whole to the parts to the whole. That is basic to inductive Bible study as I view it. You begin with the whole, you move to the parts, but then you return to the whole. So that, for example, in the study of a book, your last stage in the study of that book ought to be a summary of the meaning of that book that you have found through this process. So you move from survey to analysis to synthesis. Those are the three major movements. The second thing I would emphasize is what I said before, but adding another dimension, and that is that the movement is circular, not linear. You repeat this. For example, you don't just pray once in your lifetime before you do your first Bible study and then forget about prayer. Obviously, you return to prayer and return to these other stages as well, with various passages, but even with individual passages that you've studied before. But I want to add one more thing, and that is there is interaction between these various stages. For example, one might be focusing, and I emphasize focusing or emphasizing observation at this stage. It doesn't follow that once you start that you finish all observation, and having done that you then move to answering questions. No, you start focusing on answering questions, but in the process you may have to go back and make more observations and even ask more questions. In fact, that might even happen as you move down to evaluating and applying. You might have to do more interpretation, for example. You might have to answer more questions, even raise more questions, even make more observations. etc. So it's a matter of focus and not mutual exclusion with regard to these steps, which, as I say, are interactive. The mind cannot be put into a straitjacket. The worst thing you can do is to develop a rigid methodology and have hard and fast lines and say, you do all of this and only this and all of this first, and don't dare do anything else. And when you finish that, then you move to something else. You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. So there is flexibility here. Although I warn you that there are certain movements that need to be taken into account if the approach is to be inductive, such as observing before you interpret. Obviously, you can't reverse those because you become deductive. Interpret before you apply. Evaluate before you apply. So there are certain basic movements which you have to pay attention to, but generally speaking, there is interaction here and room for flexibility, and I think that's good to remember. Then, again, I emphasize, and I'm using recurrence, one of those laws that we'll be talking about, I emphasize the need to simplify and adapt when it's possible and when it's necessary. And let me indicate several things here. And I mentioned this already, namely that if the only thing you have people in a church do is to approach a passage that you're going to discuss together in a group, for example, and to say to those members of the group, make 10 observations on this passage. Put down 10 things you see here. Or put down a few things that strike you, that impress you. That's minimal, but very valuable. You see what I'm indicating here? Again, it's not a matter of all or nothing at all. You can do what's minimal, and then you can add and progress depending on the group and your own aptitudes and interests, etc., to further levels. Or, for example, you can use the approach that was used by Marilyn Kunz, a student of mine, and her helper in neighborhood Bible studies, which included a series of questions. In other words, the questions were asked by the leader, and people used those questions and looked at passages and tried to find answers to the questions. Or you could have people do both observations and ask some of their own questions. Or you could do what the InterVarsity plan, which was founded, by the way, by one of my students, again, Barbara Boyd, who was in charge of it for many years and is now retired. And David Bauer and I had the privilege of talking with her successor the other day, Bob Grayman. And he gave us a card, a simple card, which has printing on both sides, a copy of which we'll make available to you along with the transparencies, copies of transparencies. And by the way, those are on reserve, as I understand it, for you to make copies from. Is that correct, Doug? So here, on two sides of this small card, you have essentially what's involved in level 2 of the Bible and Life in InterVarsity. Very helpful, very helpful. So I encourage you to keep that in mind with regard to all that we do, and be aware that there are indeed means of simplifying and adapting that will enable you to do this in a very practical way with any group. I've worked with high school students, with adults. I've done it with various people. In fact, you can do it with anybody who can read, even young children who can read. It's amazing what they can observe. It's amazing what questions they can ask. So it's very, very adaptable. And I want to underline that time and time again from the standpoint of what can be done with what we're doing here. Now, what questions, if any, do you have with regard to what we've just said, or with regard to matters that we have discussed previously here in our work together. I want to give you a chance now to ask questions if you have them, but if you don't have them, we'll proceed. And I urge you again to record any questions that you might have with regard to what we say, because we're concerned about communicating with you as we go along. If you have no questions, let's then begin looking at the first matter of observe and ask, and that is the matter of observing books as wholes and then asking questions. We started looking at that in terms of looking at the definition and purpose of observing and of also of other facets here. Let's continue this and indicate first of all, and I said this before, but it bears repeating, that the simplest form in which this can be done is what I ask you to do with regard to 2 Timothy, and that is simply have people read it. One of the questions that was raised the last time I did the videotaping was by a student indicating how difficult it was for laypersons, and that student might have added seminary students to survey books as wholes without having developed skills. Don't worry, just have people read the book through. That's the lowest level, but it's an important level. If that's all that can be done, fine. And then move from there. At least they'll have a basis for beginning to see the book as a whole, and then you can guide them into further things. And then maybe you can help them to take on further steps in the process. Now, the next level would be to give a title to each chapter to become acquainted with the specific materials or contents of the book. And that technique is not hard, although giving chapter titles to discursive materials like those in the epistles is harder than it is in relation to narrative materials. But it still can be done, and people ought not to be made to feel anxious about it. See, one of the problems that people have is that they're afraid of being embarrassed by being wrong. And one of the things that we as teachers have to do is to try to be sensitive to people and try to help people to see things, which is different from what I said the other day, by the way, as I reflected. When I said, someone gave an answer and I said, no, I should not have said that. I try not to say it. We should try to help people not to be embarrassed, not to be afraid, not to do something because it might be wrong. Forget it, just do it. Right or wrong, just do it. And let's work with it and grow on the basis of what you do. Now let me talk about the characteristics of chapter titles. First of all, chapter titles ought to be descriptive and not interpretive. Remember now we're in the area of observing and not interpreting. So one ought not to ask, what is the meaning of this chapter and how can I encapsulate that meaning in a title? That's interpretive. The moment you talk about meaning, you're talking about interpretation. Simply describe what's there. And very often what you can do is what we'll do in just a moment after we finish looking at these characteristics in relation to 2 Timothy, is to lift a phrase out of the material. Then you're not interpreting, obviously, a phrase out of the material itself. That's a good way of doing it. Then it ought to be accurate, and that is so self-evident that we won't take the time to comment further. I would aim at a brief title, 3 to 5 words preferably, but here again, don't take that as the law of the Medes and Persians. That's what I would aim at, but if you need a few more words, fine. But don't get lengthy, because then you defeat the purpose of giving chapter titles. Now, sometimes, because of what at least looks like disparate material in chapters, you might feel that you ought to give, say, 2 titles to a chapter. That's okay. That's okay. I would aim at 1 title for a chapter, and we'll indicate how that can function in just a moment. And then chapter titles ought to be relatively distinctive. That is to say, they ought to point to that chapter as over against other chapters. And one of the ways of doing that is to be as specific as possible. For example, if you say in relation to the book of Mark, chapter 5, miracles of Jesus. You have miracles all over the place. That doesn't tell you anything about chapter 5. Now, if you say the raising of Jairus' daughter, which is the last miracle there, and the climactic miracle, raising someone from the dead, which is pretty climactic, then you know that you're dealing with that chapter. You don't find that anywhere else in the gospel, you say. So try to be relatively distinctive by trying to be as specific as possible. Then there are 2 ways of approaching chapter titles. They can be comprehensive, that is to say, they can be titles which cover the entire unit. And by the way, at this stage, I would deal with chapters. Later on, you might decide that a chapter is not really the way to divide the material, that there's a segment that you need to recognize. We talked about the difference between the two. If you have any questions at that point, let me know. A title might be comprehensive, cover everything in the chapter unit, or you might need to make it suggestive and associative. That is to say, pick out something. Don't worry about it being the most important thing, but pick out something in the chapter with which you can associate other elements in the chapter. Now, for example, the title I just used with regard to Mark 5, the raising of Jairus' daughter, involves just 1 miracle, but it reminds me that it's a miracle chapter, and then I think of the other miracles. Gerasene demoniac, the stilling of the storm in chapter 4, but if you're dealing just with 5, the Gerasene demoniac and the healing of the woman with the hemorrhage, along with the raising of Jairus' daughter. You see, by association, then I think of the other things. And we'll talk about purposes in just a moment. And then it ought to be individual. It ought to serve your purpose. There is no single right name for a chapter. There are various ways of naming chapters. As long as the chapter title serves the purpose for you and those whom you teach, fine. Don't worry about finding the one right title for chapters. Now, chapter titles have the following purposes and values, and these are good to keep in mind as you do this and as you encourage people to do this. And I would think there's not any great reason why people ought not to do this. And by the way, I'll disclose things here in units so I don't keep moving to that projector, which poses problem for the video. There are the 4 R's, I call them. 1, giving chapter titles encourages reflection. In other words, you have to think about what's there. And that, of course, enhances observation, while it involves awareness. So you have to ask yourself, now, how shall I call this chapter? Let me see what's here. Second purpose and value is recollection, or recall, or remembering what's there. In fact, one of the valuable things about chapter titles is that they might serve as a basis for thinking through a book. I could illustrate that if I had the time here. So if you use chapter titles to think through a book and recall what is in the book in terms of specific contents or material, that's valuable. It's also a way of reference. It's a means of referring to materials. You know, the parables of the kingdom chapter. That's Mark 4, say. Or the Great Confession chapter in Mark 8, or what have you. You see, it's a way of referring to materials as over against making a long description of those materials. And finally, it's a way of beginning to see relationships, how things connect with each other. Because the titles will indicate things that are similar, things that are different, changes, directions, what have you. So these are the four purposes and values of chapter titles. Now let me illustrate using visualization here from 2 Timothy. And you note I used slanted lines. I might have slanted them more in order to be able to see what's there quickly, and this is one of the purposes of a chart, see what's there quickly without having to crane my neck too much. I have a neck spur, and that complicates craning my neck. I don't have to go like this. Nor do I list them this way. Listing them this way doesn't give you the movement and the perspective that you get with a horizontal chart. We'll talk about visualization just a moment. So there are 4 chapters here, and I might call them Rekindle the Gift, which again by association leads me to think of the other things that surround that and are connected with it. And then Remember Jesus Christ, the 2nd chapter. The 3rd chapter, the Last Days chapter. And the 4th chapter, Fulfill Your Ministry. And now these are not comprehensive titles, you understand. These are suggestive, associative. They are elements here which, by association, remind me of other elements in these materials. Now let me talk briefly about this matter of visualization. We are told that 80% of what we learn comes through the eye gate. I don't know whether you've seen that statistic, Harold. If that's anywhere near true, that's amazing. In fact, that's the reason why we have these overheads, not because we want you to copy all this material down, but because it's reinforcing what I am saying that comes to you through your ears. It's a twofold barrage, an ear barrage and an eye barrage. And the two together will impress things on you more than would be the case if I simply dealt with voice, sound and sight. So I would always record my findings and encourage people to record their findings and encourage people to visualize. And by the way, one of the appendices in Methodical Bible Study deals with charts. We'll show you some more charts here, including not only horizontal ones, but also vertical ones. And there are various diagrams you can make. It's an area in which you can be very, very creative. Now, I'm going to do something here that embarrasses me a little bit, but I think I'll do it anyway. A student of mine he's written several books, one of which he dedicated to me, which I appreciated. This one, the latest one, is calling Learning to Learn, toward a philosophy of education. Jerry Gill is the student. I don't know whether you are aware of him. Anyway, he very kindly cites me as one of the 2 professors in his experience that had the most impact on him, on his learning and his teaching. And I'm going to read some of this, which includes this matter of visualization. And if you can just forget me and just think of the ideas involved, which will tell you the kinds of things I'm concerned about doing and I'm concerned about your doing, that will serve the purpose. Just try to forget that I am involved in it. He says this concerning what we did together at the Biblical Seminary in New York. The hallmark of the teaching was a continual emphasis on approaching every subject inductively, on letting each text speak for itself. He developed and practiced a thorough methodology for minimizing of preconceived notions about topics and texts, and the maximizing of one's first-hand grappling with the particular features of the material. Naturally, he sought to implement this methodology in his classroom activity so as to model and instill the skills which embodied it. And modeling is extremely important. Thus, his classes were always characterized by a combination of systematic rigor and inductive procedures. He invariably began each class by engaging a specific student in a conversation about a text or topic. Note this dialogical element that's emphasized. Generally, he gave us a list of concrete questions and exercises on which to base our explorations and preparations. Then he proceeded to draw from the students their findings and reflections, summarizing and diagramming them on the chalkboard. And you'll see this is what caught his attention in a primary way. This was, by the way, before the day of overheads, so we had to do everything on the chalkboard that was visualized. To facilitate the class discussion, he always employed the students' own key terms and reasoning patterns, but was able to integrate them with the contributions of other students and with his own ideas. After a while, he would turn to another student, picking up a different tack or aspect of the lesson. From time to time, other students volunteered questions and information. At the close of the class, he took a few minutes to summarize our findings and point in the direction of our future explorations. He then collected the homework and made suggestions, etc. Now let me read this paragraph too. He kept everyone intensely engaged. That's the dialogical element, participatory element. He did this by his open yet relentless stalking posture and the team spirit he was able to engender. I think he's idealized me a bit, but anyway. We truly felt as if our participation was crucial to the discovery of the meaning and significance of the text or topic. He treated everyone as competent and involved, always expected our best, and refused to let us off the hook when we tried to plead ignorance. You have the text there before you. What does it suggest to you? That's your direct contact with the text, he would ask. He never belittled or browbeat anyone, but his high and positive expectations motivated us to push ourselves further. More than a few students complained or bragged about having a headache after a class with him. He became impatient only when students tried to hide behind traditional or trendy terminology or abstractions. Let's stick to the text, he would say. I should say a word about his use of the chalkboard. This apparently, it's interesting to see what impresses people as a result of what you do. That's one reason why I'm reading this. Since this procedure has become such a vital part of my own classroom work. Although the board was inevitably covered with sentences, let me see here, summarizing our various findings and suggestions, there were always numerous diagrammatic lines as well. Circles, boxes, arrows indicated the possible relationships. We talked about relationships among ideas. Sometimes these relationships were temporal and were laid out on a timeline. Other times they were spatial or logical, such as with continua or syllogisms. He never offered the diagrams as the final truth, only as a means of charting our course and stimulating further thought. He did, however, encourage us to think diagrammatically so as to be able to reflect on and keep track of the many possible relationships among the information and ideas involved. Even a simple diagram can say more and say it more quickly than a long paragraph, and paragraphs can come later. The most effective aspect of his approach to teaching was the definite sense one received that here was a person putting his whole being into learning, both in helping you learn and in furthering his own learning. And the book, I remind you, is entitled Learning How to Learn. Well, I think I've read enough of it here to indicate the kind of thing we're trying to do. And if people are generous enough and gracious enough, and he's very generous and gracious in saying this, to catch these kinds of things, then we're doing what we're talking about here. So forgive me for that personal reference, but I think it summarizes in certain ways emphases that we have made, including this emphasis on visualization, that perhaps is better than I could do it in terms of what we're about. All right, now let's look at another level, further level. Now, you can stop at any one of these levels, particularly with the people with whom you work, but here's a further level, and that is to observe general materials. And those general materials may involve persons. We call them biographical, methodical Bible study, but here again you can use simple terminology, persons, such as in Genesis. By the way, Genesis has two major units. Incidentally, knowing what the major materials are, I'll talk about that a little further in just a moment, helps you to see groupings of materials, which is the next step here. Genesis is essentially biographical, and you have two major groupings of persons. First, in 1 to 11, roughly, you have God dealing with the entire human race. And it's made up primarily of two narratives, the Adam narrative and the Noah narrative. And then in 12 following, you have God dealing with the patriarchs. So you have the Abraham narrative and the Jacob narrative and the Joseph narrative. 12 to 25, Abraham, 26 to 36, Jacob, and 37 to 50, Joseph. And you see, those are the large blocks of material that you have in that book. Or events, the book of Joshua, historical, the events involving the conquest of Canaan. Or places like Exodus. In Egypt, there are three units geographically. In Egypt, 1 through 12. On the way to Sinai, 13 through 18. 19 following through 40 at Sinai. See? Or ideas, as you have in the epistles, and as we have in 2 Timothy, in which we'll come to that in just a moment. What ideas do you have here? Now, there are various values. Let me emphasize, as I do here, that these things overlap. Obviously, persons do things, so they're involved in events. Events take place in places. Persons often engage in discourse, so you have ideas. So these things overlap. It's a question of emphasis or primacy. What is the focus, you say? Now, being aware of this will provide many clues, as I said, regarding the groupings of material, as well as clues about how these materials function. And some of this will come out as we talk about literary forms a little later on. And I think we'll just move on unless you have questions at this stage. Now, here again, let me remind you, since we want to be dialogical as much as we can, although we're pressed for time, if you have any questions at any point that you feel you want to ask or need to ask, raise your hand and we'll try to clarify these things further. We're going through a lot of material, I realize, pretty quickly, and we don't expect you to absorb it all by any means, but we hope that you'll have some kind of record so you can go back over it. All right. Just raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. The next level, you see, you can stop at any one of these levels, is to look for major groupings of material, or what we call the structure of the book, how the book is constructed, how it's organized, how it's arranged. And the key to seeing the construction, structure of a book, or arrangement, or organization, what have you, is to look for laws of relationship, especially the law of recurrence. Now, going back to Genesis, the reason why I saw the groupings I outlined was that I saw that the emphasis was on persons, and a certain person would be treated recurringly up to a certain point, at least as the dominant person, and then the text would pick up someone else, Adam, and then Noah, and then Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob, although it's Jacob who's dominant, and then Joseph, you see, recurringly. So which of the chapters involved Adam? Those are brought together into the narrative. Noah, there's also the Babel narrative in Genesis 11, and then Abraham and Jacob and Joseph. So the law of recurrence, particularly when you have in mind these kinds of literature, will help you find groupings of material that move towards seeing how a book or a unit is constructed. Now let me talk about these laws, and we'll discuss individual ones. First of all, there are primary laws, those which control the bulk of the materials. Now remember, we're looking at the book as a whole, so we want to remain in the presence of the book as a whole. We don't want to get caught up in a myriad of the many relationships you find in a book as a whole, particularly a long book. If you start looking for all the relationships in Genesis, I don't know how many you'd have. I haven't counted them, but you'd have hundreds, if not thousands. And then you get bogged down in detail. Remember, this is the bird's eye view, not the worm's eye view. So we're looking for those that dominate the bulk of the material, or all the material of the book as a whole. Then we're looking for relationships which are implicit, that is to say unexpressed, as well as those that are explicit, that is to say expressed. We talked about implications. You have to read between the lines. And that's very true of relationships. Now we'll begin discussing more of these laws. We'll begin with recurrence. I cannot emphasize enough the supreme importance of looking for relationships, looking for these laws of structure, however you want to describe them. We'll talk more about that. I'll say that several times here. And I hope to impress that on your mind. You know, I've been trying to impress certain things on your mind, sort of hammering at them. Here's one that I want to hammer at again, you know. Let's look at 2 Timothy now, and look at some of these laws which are so important for getting at the meaning of a book. Before we do that, let me do some more hammering, if I may, here, emphasizing the supreme importance of relationships. They make the difference between order and chaos, between meaning and meaninglessness, between what a chimpanzee can produce sitting at a typewriter and great literature, including the literature of the Bible. That ought to be a picture that captures your imagination. Just think of a chimp sitting at a typewriter or a computer, pecking away. Now what you'd get is a series of random letters. The only problem the chimpanzee has, is relationships. Just one thing that makes a difference between his writing or doing what he's doing, if you call it writing, and Shakespeare or the Bible. Because when you come right down to it, it's relating letters to each other in terms of words, individual words, words in terms of phrases, phrases in terms of sentences, sentences in terms of paragraphs, paragraphs and groups of paragraphs in terms of a total literary work. And the key is relationships. So I would urge you always to look for relationships. They are the key to meaning. Now, of course, we want to find them. We also want to make use of them if we are to get at the meaning of what the text is saying. And I would urge you to look everywhere for relationships, outside the Scriptures as well as inside the Scriptures. As I will go on to say, and I'm hammering away using recurrence. Pardon me for being so insistent, but there are certain things I want people to go away with from what I do. And one of the things I hope you will never forget in terms of what other work you've done in inductive Bible study and what we're doing here is this matter of relationships. Always look for relationships. As Dr. White of the Biblical Seminary used to say, things hook and eye together. It's one of the most important elements in language and literature. Note my repetition. Keep saying that. From the book as a whole to individual sentences and parts of sentences. In other words, it runs the gamut. It's everywhere. And it's implicit as well as explicit. Again, I emphasize that because that's extremely significant. But by the way, these relationships function only when you're dealing with two or more components. And by the way, there's an excellent essay by John Ruskin entitled Essay on Composition. Composition is another word for structure. And Ruskin defines composition as putting two or more things together so as to make one out of them. So you can't have relationships if you have just one thing. You have to have two or more components to tie together to have relationships. And what I do with regard to connections which express relationships is put a circle around them. Now, we'll do that with some of 2 Timothy, but I could show you my Bible here. And by the way, I would encourage you to try to get a Bible with wide margins so you can write in your Bible and with a kind of paper so that you don't ruin it by writing on it. You'll see that I've not only written in the margins but in the text. And one of the things I do, particularly with discursive materials, where connections and connectives are so important, is to put circles around them. The first one is by in verse 1 of chapter 1. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by means of the will of God. See, that's instrumentation, causal instrumentation. According to, which is comparison, the will of God. In verse 3, I thank God whom I serve with a clear conscience, as did my fathers. As suggests what? Now don't be afraid. Better try and be wrong than not to try at all. Come on, what does as suggest there? As my fathers. Comparison. Yeah. compares himself with his fathers. So I put a circle around as. Well, I have circles, and I also put check marks in the margin, so I know where those connections are. Very, very helpful by way of making you aware of relationships, of connections, and especially in this kind of literature where so many connections are explicit. Now, there are some implicit ones as well that we'll talk about as we move on here. Now, let's move to specific laws, beginning with the law of recurrence. And I emphasize that the dictionary will help you with these definitions. Use your dictionary frequently. For example, and by the way, I would look at recurrence in terms of either the same or similar forms, and just to tie something up with what you perhaps did in English Bible, although I don't know, the recurring use of the very same thing, for example, the same word, we call repetition. The recurring use of similar things is continuity. For example, in Mark's Gospel, you have the recurring use, of course, of Jesus, the Son of Man, over and over again. That's the same thing. But you have the recurrence of miracles. Now, to have repetition of miracles, you'd have to have the same miracles done over and over and over and over again. You don't have that, but they're similar, you say. So the miracle element is very, very significant. Now, in 2 Timothy, the significant element here is that this is what we call a hortatory epistle. That's to say, it involves essentially exhortations. And in fact, what I have done, again in the margins, is put alongside every exhortation EXN, or EX, to indicate exhortation. Some are implied or indirect, and some are very direct. And incidentally, the difference between exhortation and declaration is often involved in mood. If you get into grammar, you might not know it, but it's grammar. Declarations are in the indicative mood. They are statements or assertions. Exhortations are calls to action in the imperative or a comparable mood. So when the writer says, do something, the writer is exhorting. And the first exhortation is indirect, but it's there in 1:6. Hence I remind you to rekindle the gift of God that is within you. That's an exhortation. Now, the book is made up really of a series of exhortations, and we'll look at the other dimensions in just a moment. Now, if you had simply a series of exhortations, you would have continuity of exhortations. To have repetition, you'd have to have the same exhortation over and over and over again. For example, be joyful, be joyful, be joyful, be joyful, be joyful, be joyful. Well, there is some variety here, but you do have some repetition. You have continuity, recurrence with regard to exhortations. You have some repetition in terms of certain ideas which will provide us with certain clues as to how to combine these things. Now, by the way, recurrence is usually implicit. The writer doesn't tell you, as I said before in verse 1:4, I am now saying again. You say, he just does it, and you have to pick it up. You have to be observant. See? Now, we'll find that, for example, this matter of not being ashamed, and by the way, you have other ways of expressing that. Not being timid is one of them that you have there at the end of the first paragraph. Not ashamed is found in 1:8, 1:12, and 1:16, along with a recurring emphasis on suffering. And there's an interesting relationship, as you might expect, between those two in 1:8, 2:3, and 2:9, including remembering Jesus Christ who suffered. So you're looking for things that appear in the same or similar form a number of times with important materials. Don't count the ands in the book, please. That's just a waste of time saying, well, this and is very important in this book. I counted 350 of them. So what? Yeah, so it's with important, distinctive materials that you're looking for the use of these relationships. All right, let's move on here now, and I'm very, very interested that you know the meaning of these relationships and be able to spot them and identify them. Very, very important. If you have any questions as to what these relationships are, don't hesitate to indicate them. And by the way, I could use you much more by way of calling attention to these, but again, we're pressed for time. But with laypersons, I would ask you to engage them as much as possible when you have longer time periods than we have here. Don't worry about that dark line there. I wrote something there that I wanted to blot out, so I decided to underline relationships heavily there to impress on your mind the importance of relationships. Contrast, which means associating things that are opposites. You can look that up in a dictionary. The dictionary will tell you. Wise, in Proverbs, wise persons and fools. And the purpose of contrast is to illuminate one or both of the opposites. Now, I could get into certain technicalities with regard to other kinds of contrast, but I won't do that to save time. Now, there are some explicit indicators of contrasts, such as but or rather than. Look at chapter 3, for example. You have in verse 4 of chapter 3, let me see, wait a minute, it's not, oh yeah, rather than. He's describing these men of the last days. They are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. You see the contrast there. Or look at verse 5. Now this one is implicit. There are persons who have certain characteristics. Don't you have the same characteristics? Avoid such people and avoid associating with them, because you're liable to become like them, you see. So, and that's the exhortation. It's a negative exhortation. Don't associate with them. Don't do those things that will cause you to become like them. And then in verse 9, there's a but. These men also oppose the truth, men of corrupt mind and counterfeit faith, but they will not get very far. Now, what is being contrasted there is not very clear. There's an implicit contrast. In contrast to what they think, namely that they're going to get very far by doing these things. Or in contrast to what you might think, and that is that these things that they do will get them very far, they will not get very far. Now, he doesn't tell you that, does he? You have to infer that. Again, read between the lines, you see? That's why I keep telling you, look for things that are implicit as well as explicit. You understand what I mean by implicit? Implied and not expressed. Explicit is expressed. You have to look for the implicit, otherwise you won't find these relationships. Well, we won't go through all of these. Other kinds used elsewhere, however, nevertheless, yet, which Paul uses in this epistle, by the way, etc. Now, comparison. Here you have both explicit comparisons and implicit comparisons involving both similes, which are explicit, where you have the word like used. For example, he says, or as, same thing in 2:3, take your share of suffering as or like a good soldier. That's a simile. A metaphor does not express the comparative connection. You have to infer it. For example, he says in verse 6, it is the hard-working farmer who ought to have the first share of the crops. Now, he doesn't say in that case, you are or should be like the hard-working farmer, does he? He says, in effect, you are a hard-working farmer. It's like our saying to someone, you're a lion. Well, you don't quite mean that he's an animal with 4 legs and a mane and roams around in Africa somewhere. You are like a lion. And by the way, do you know that one of the major controversies of the church revolved around this whole matter of whether you're dealing with a metaphor or a literal statement? This is my body, Jesus says, of the bread. And of the cup, the wine, he says, this is my blood. Now, is that a literal statement? Yes, say the Roman Catholics. That's why they believe in transubstantiation, that the elements are changed into the literal, actual body and blood of Christ, whereas the statement might mean, this is like my body broken for you, and this is like my blood shed for you. Now, that's the Protestant view. Although there are those who are in between who believe in consubstantiation, presence of Christ along with the elements. So if you don't have the elements, you don't have Christ. That's the middle ground. I have my problems with that too. But anyway, we won't talk theology. But you see, this is a great conflict of the centuries, and it revolves around this whole matter of whether you're dealing with a metaphor, since you don't have the like there expressed, or whether you're dealing with a literal statement. Okay. By the way, let me say here, as I'll say later on, and that is, some of these connectors may mean different things in different contexts. For example, the word so may involve comparison in one context. In another context, it may involve causation, the movement from cause to effect. If I say, I became sick, so I went home. See, I'm using so in lieu of therefore. So you have to be very, very careful not to identify relationships by words in isolation, but rather by words in their context. Now, incidentally, causation involves, and with laypersons, you can just say cause, arrow, effect, movement from cause to effect. They have a problem with causation. Again, you can simplify it apt. Involves that which produces something, followed by that which is produced by something. So, it is my sickness that produced or resulted in my going home. You see? Now, we won't take the time to look at these. Another illustration of a word that can be used in several ways is a then. Now, then sometimes is a temporal indicator. He first went home, then he went to the store. Now, that's not cause-effect. Simply two things in a series which follow each other sequentially in terms of time, you see. But sometimes, as is indicated in 1:8, you have a then which is a connector indicating causation. Do not be ashamed then. Now, I'm not talking about when, but as a result of what I have said. Here's his exhortation, do not be ashamed. Okay? Now you may reverse the sequence and have the effect first, followed by the cause. I can say, I was sick, therefore I went home, or I went home because I was sick. Now, because introduces the cause. You see? Now, here's another one of these connectors that may be used in various ways. Sometimes since is temporal. Sometimes it's logical. So I went home since I was sick. It's different from my saying I have been home since yesterday. There's no causal connection between being home and yesterday. I'm simply indicating when, time, you see, not connections. You see, are you getting my point? You have to be very careful as you interpret these connectors, these explicit indications of relationships, so that you get the right ones. And by the way, very often it helps to expand the connections, to paraphrase them, to find out what they mean. If you can put an expanded version which captures a relationship in the place of what you have there, it helps with regard to finding whether that relationship is really what you have there. So, I was sick since, or I went home since I was sick. If you can say, I went home because I was sick, you see, then you know that the connection is one of substantiation. Of course, you have to be careful, as we've indicated before, not to move beyond self-evident minimal interpretation, because otherwise you become deductive. This process of induction is very fragile and can be broken at any time, and you have to be careful not to break it. And by the way, it's not always clear what's self-evident and what's minimal. Now, the moment I say, I observe the presence of but, and I go on to say, there is a contrast here. I'm moving from pure observation to minimal interpretation. See, what I'm saying is, the word B-U-T means contrast. The moment I say means, I'm interpreting. See, what does this mean? I'm answering that interpretive question. So you have to be careful when you're doing it. But observation would become puerile if you didn't do minimal, self-evident interpretation as you observe. But you always have to do it tentatively and subject to change if and when it's warranted by the evidence. Then there's the means to the end, which is instrumentation, and that too may follow one of two sequences, either means to the end or end followed by the means, although there is a modification we have to add with regard to the second kind of movement. Means to end is indicated very often by in order that. Now here again you have to be careful of the use of that. See, that boy is going to school. Now that doesn't indicate instrumentation. See, that doesn't. The that you have here in verse 317, one of the verses we'll be looking at, that the man of God, or if you can say, here again expanding, you see, in order that the man of God, then you know you have instrumentation. Means to end. Understand? If you don't understand these relationships, please tell me, because if what I've said is true, and that is these relationships are absolutely critical, and you don't understand them, then you're going to be missing what's absolutely critical. So please let me know if you don't understand them, because it's extremely important. Now, the reverse can be true, although it introduces an instrumental cause here by the use of with the use of such things as by or through. We looked at one, for example, in 1:1 of 2 Timothy. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by means of the will of God. See, the moment I can say by means of the will of God, I'm indicating means follows the by. Sometimes the preposition is through, as we have it, for example, in chapter 3, when we won't take the time to look at that. So, and by the way, the apostleship involves both God's purpose with regard to his will and also the result of his expressing his will. So you have a combination. That's why I call it instrumental cause or causal instrument, causal means. The two are combined. And the two are closely related, although sometimes it's very important to distinguish between them, since sometimes purposes are not realized. God could have a purpose. For example, God could have this very wonderful purpose with regard to Scripture, which he inspires, and people might not realize it. So the purpose is not the result necessarily. The purpose is what God intends to be the result, but it may not be the result. You see? Well, you have to differentiate between purpose and result, although sometimes the two merge. As to say, what is purposed is what actually happens. These things sound highly technical, but they're tremendously important for proper understandings. So I would urge you to work at these relationships. And then let me indicate two more. One is interrogation, a question sometimes followed by an answer. Now, when you read the Gospels, you know that sometimes Jesus was asked a question and didn't answer, or sometimes he asked a question and the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes wouldn't answer, so sometimes it's just a question. Or it might be a problem without a question mark. Of course, a question has a question mark after it, so you can identify a question. An excellent example of interrogation in terms of both question and answer is found in Proverbs, which I've been reading lately, in 23, verses 29, 30. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eye? That's a recurrence of questions. Recurrence of interrogation. Answer. Those who tarry long over wine, those who go to try mixed wine. The answer. Very frequently used in biblical literature. And of course, I've asked you questions and you've answered me, right? We've used interrogation. That's a very, very common device. Implicitly, it involves problem followed by solution, if there is a solution. For example, Romans in 1 to 11 begins by a description in 1:18 following of the universal problem of sin, followed then by the presentation of the gospel of Christ based on justification by faith in 3:21 following, which is also universal. Now, Paul doesn't tell you, I'm going to begin this book by describing the problem. And then to 3:21, having described this problem, I now move to the solution. It's not explicit. Doesn't put a question mark at the end of 3:20. But it's interrogation nonetheless. Problem followed by solution. That's what question followed by answer is, essentially. Although it's not, answers are not always solutions. But the principle there is there essentially. And then the movement from the particular to the general, which is generalization, or the movement from the general to the particular, which is particularization. Now, by the way, in 2 Timothy, see how many of these things, most of these things we can find in 2 Timothy. How many of these things we can find here? Look, for example, at verses 11 and 12 of chapter 3. talks about my persecutions, my sufferings, and then he particularizes what befell me at Antioch, Iconium, and at Lystra, what persecutions I endured. Now, those are not all the persecutions he endured. Those are just some of them, see. And then, having talked about himself, he makes a statement in 12, indeed, all who, like me, desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. You see how he moves from the particular to the general, which is generalization. And then the movement from the particular you find in an excellent way in Hebrews 11, where you have the statement opening by his description of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. By faith, men of old realized certain things. And then he starts talking about men of old. By faith, Abel. The whole thing is a roll of men of old. And by the way, men is used generically there because it includes women of old, too, in the chapter. So that's particularization, see. Now, all of these are important because the things that are related need to be seen in connection with each other to interpret them. You can't really understand what the author of Hebrews, who is not Paul, by the way, but the author of Hebrews means by faith when he uses the word faith unless you looked at that general statement opening the chapter. Every time he uses faith, you have to take his description of faith in Hebrews 11:1 and put it in the place of faith. See? Otherwise, you won't understand it. It's the reality of the unseen. It's seeing the unseen. By the way, that's a slightly different emphasis with regard to faith as over against the Pauline emphasis, which involves trust and entrusting oneself. They're connected, but the emphasis is slightly different. Well, again I say, I'm indicating explicitly recurrence. Again I say, would always look for relationships, would circle explicit relationships when you have indicators, but would also look for implicit relationships because things always do hook and eye together, otherwise they wouldn't make any sense. Otherwise you'd have just a string of ideas. So I would always look for relationships if you want meanings. Would be aware that explicit connectors sometimes have different meanings, although the meanings of some are constant. For example, but always suggests contrast, but as we've indicated, so may indicate comparison or causation, determined by context, among other things. And finally, do use a dictionary to find the meanings of these relationships, if you're unclear. Now, let me give you some illustrations of looking for these relationships everywhere by showing you some ads on the monitor there. And I will look at them here because in some cases I won't be able to read the monitor. You won't be able to read the monitor fully either, but at least we'll proceed here. This one is easy to read. Now, doing business in the Big Apple is almost as easy as apple pie. So the two components that are related are, of course, the Big Apple and apple pie. If an ad has just one component, you have no relationships. You don't have to have composition. It has to have two or more components. This has two components. How are the two related here? Comparison, basically comparison. Of course, apple, the recurring use of the word apple, helps you to see the connection. But there is another dimension here. And what is it? Along with the comparison. Look at the word almost, which indicates what? That's Contrast. If it said, doing business in the Big Apple is as easy as apple pie, you would have pure comparison. But you have major comparison with an element of contrast. Now, this is just one example of how relationships can be combined. We call them complex relationships and not merely simple or single relationships. Okay? I have fun going through ads doing this. It's the next one. 3 years ago, I'm not sure you can read this, 3 years ago, they never expected Taiwan to produce a world-class airline. And then you have a picture of this beautiful plane, the wings of Taiwan. What's the relationship there? Implicit. Contrast. They didn't expect this 3 years ago, but it's here now. You see? Or take the next one. Now this is a little harder to read, but under the dancers you have the word precision movements. Comparison. Okay. There's precision in this, in these watches, in this watch, just as there is in the dancing. Or take this next one. Now this next one is an interesting one. I don't think I've ever seen an ad like this. It involves multiple choices, and you can't read them, so I'll have to read them for you. Some people might think that my new Saab convertible is A, a toy, B, a phase I'm going through, C, a last desperate grab for youth. Now, you can choose any one of those. Doesn't really make much difference. These people are no doubt A, misguided, B, jealous, C, just plain mean. Choose any one of those. The Saab is the most, and you have multiple choice, except that all three are versatile, A, B, and C. The most versatile car I've ever A, owned, B, leased, C, borrowed from my brother-in-law. It has loads of A, trunk space, B, passenger room, C, safety features. Frankly, it never occurred to me that the Saab convertible is A, a classic, B, a real head-turner, C, the perfect car for a midnight drive sometime in June when the skies are clear and still and the air flows across my skin like warm silk comparison. And there's just me and someone I love and a deserted country road spilling out before us. That's a clever ad, isn't it? What's involved here? Well, is it comparison or is it contrast? It's contrast between this toy and this guy and all that kind of stuff, and then this great car, which provides ample reasons for buying this car, not just because you want to return to your youth or because you're misguided. In what sense?
In that you're going from the general to the particular, that my car is like, and then you're describing particular things that it's like, or?
Not really, because there's no general statement. You see, if for particularization you need to have a general statement, and then it's drawn out. I'll show you one with particularization in just a moment. Let's go to the next one here. Since you can't control market fluctuations or interest rates, how can you control your financial future? Interrogation. Good, that's question mark. Nobody can predict market swings. One thing is certain, change is constant. Savvy investors are planning well ahead. Start now, prepare for a long-term financial plan, etc. That's implicit. Yeah. Since you can't control it, it follows that you ought to do this long-term planning. And I've been working with finances, and that's good advice, by the way. See, these things are often combined. I'm glad you saw that dimension of it. For example, always in contrast there is comparison. Because there's no point in contrasting things that are not comparable. I mean, there's no point in talking about the differences between an apple and nails. There is a point in talking about the difference between apples and oranges, or apples and bananas. But you see, they're comparable. They're all fruits. You see? So these things do have comparable dimensions. Now here's the next one, and I think the final one. We've built communications systems from scratch for plenty of clients. Take Australia, for example. Now that's particularization. See, you have the general statement. And by the way, I've been particularizing time and time again in these discussions. The moment I make a general statement about laws, and I say, for example, here's one law. Now the biblical text doesn't do that for you. And yet, it particularizes or generalizes. It doesn't tell you, now I'm going to make a general statement, now I'm following that by a particular example, or for example. So it's not explicit, it's implicit, but it's there nonetheless. Now here it's explicit, for example. Take Australia, you see. So I would urge you to look everywhere for these relationships. It's just amazing how you'll become accustomed to looking for them and finding them, how it'll become a matter of second nature to you. And I'll tell you, it'll change things around dramatically for you. And so I would urge you to do this. Any questions about these relationships now, what we've said? Yes?
Are these relationships found in Western culture, or are they found in all cultures and all literature?
They're found in all cultures and all literature. You take, there's no way of translating the Bible, for example, which is translated into umpteen languages, without using some kind of connectors. I mean, these connectors are involved in language itself. There's no way of using a language without using these kinds of connectors, for the most part. They're also used in broader ways in literature beyond language, linguistic characteristics. But they're used in all cultures. Yes?
Could you elaborate a little bit on the difference between causation and instrumentation? They seem like...
Yeah, they're closely related, yeah. Causation involves something which produces something else. Instrumentation involves one means. Now, causes may involve means, but may involve other elements besides means. For example, I hit the ball and consequently it went over the wall. That's one of my dreams. I hit the ball and consequently it went over the wall. Now, that is not means, that's cause. I hit the ball by watching the rotation of the ball carefully, and consequently it went over the wall. Now, you see, when I say by, I'm adding another dimension. By means of. You see? Then instrumentation also involves purpose, which, as I say, is sometimes closely related with result, but sometimes needs to be differentiated from result. Because what is purposed sometimes does not happen. For example, God sent His Son in order to save the whole world. Now that's different. Yeah, that's purpose. That's different from saying God sent His Son and as a result the whole world was saved. You see? I mean, some believe that, but that's universalism. But there's a great difference between the first and second statement. The first involves purpose, the second involves result. Now, sometimes what is purposed is what happens, so the two merge. You see? Okay? Any other questions? That's a good question. Any other questions? Now, I think time is flying, but I think we'd better stop here in terms of what we're going to present. I have a notion you've had a good load to take into account here. But let me close now by asking if you have any questions about any of these matters that at least we can keep in mind as we proceed on this coming Tuesday. Any questions?
Just an observation, I guess, about implication. I was thinking back to what you said, I am, or this is my body. I thought, but he also said, I am the door. He also said, I am the vine. And then I got to wondering, do they ever state explicitly, you are like? And I thought, yeah, because it says we are like sheep.
That's right.
So the explicit and the implied is not consistent, nor is, but the question is our interpretation going to be consistently literal or consistently implied, or the other option, I guess, is that we do it inductively and find out what the meaning really is.
Right, right. Yeah, well, we'll talk more about that because one of the great problems that's involved in biblical interpretation is the failure to distinguish between analogy and identicalness. And part of that has to do with the use of metaphor, where you don't have an expressed connection. So I am the door. Is that a literal statement? Like this is my body, this is my blood? Or is that a metaphor, which is a figurative statement, which really means I am like the door, like a door, you see. Now, people often say evangelicals, sometimes they say fundamentalists, are people who believe the Bible literally. Well, it depends on what you mean by that. If by that you mean that when the Bible describes an event like creation, they believe that that event really happened, which, by the way, is an evaluation. See, that's a belief statement. That's not an interpretation, that's an evaluation. Say, I believe that what the Bible describes in this place really happened. That's one thing. But if by that one means that one ought to interpret every statement literally, then you're in big trouble. Because the Bible contains two kinds of statements. And anything can be expressed in one of two ways, either literally or figuratively. And you have to interpret in accordance with what the use is in the text. So if it's intended by the author to be literal, then you need to interpret it literally. Now that's different from evaluating it, see, whether or not it happened. You have to interpret it literally. If it's meant by the author as a figurative statement, then you need to interpret it figuratively. Now sometimes it's hard to know. And that's why you have the great discussion about the opening chapters of Genesis. Are those chapters intended by the author to be literal? For example, with regard to, say, the serpent in Genesis 3, or were they intended to be figurative? And you have to answer that question before you go to the belief question, the evaluation question. You know, I believe this literally happened. Well, of course, I'm not suggesting which it is. I'm simply saying you have to make the interpretive decision first before you then make a decision about what you believe actually happened, which is an evaluation. You see? But this is extremely, extremely important in getting at any literature, and certainly at the Bible. Any other questions? Okay, have a good weekend, and we'll look forward to resuming on next Tuesday.